for coming here today for this side event on climate change and land degradation. My name is Alisher Mirzabaev. I'm a senior researcher here at Center for Development Research. And the program for today, we have two background presentations by Dr. Hafdís Hanna Aegisdóttir and by myself on natural and socio-economic aspects of interaction between climate change and land degradation. And after that, we will move to the panel discussions, and I will introduce our eminent panelists during that time. So right now, let us start with the first presentation right away, if it's fine with you. I would like to welcome here Dr. Aegisdóttir, who is the program director for the UNU Land Restoration Training Program based in Iceland. She has been working a lot on this land restoration training capacity building issues, especially since 2010 when she joined the UNU program in Iceland. And then she has also developed curriculum, very different activities around capacity building on land restoration. And besides, addition to that, she has also she conducts a lot of research on plant and restoration ecology. Welcome, Dr. Aegisdóttir. Let me find your presentation. Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to this side event. I'm very proud to be here, very honored to be offered to give this talk, this background talk on climate change, land degradation interactions, biophysical aspects. So this is planet Earth. This is our planet. And climate change is, like you know, a major threat to our planet and the amazing life it hosts. And in my work for the UNU Land Restoration Training Program, I have been lucky enough to travel to some of the most remote and magnificent places on planet Earth, and I have learned to know people who live and work directly on the land, and I've also learned to know that climate change and land degradation is threatening now their livelihood. These Mongolian nomads in the Gobi Desert dread the winter. Their livelihood is now threatened due to land degradation and climate change. The winters have been hard and the livestock has been killed, and I visited them last year. In another continent, in Niger Republic in West Africa. Niger Republic is a very big country. It's 12 the size of my home country, Iceland, and 3.5 the size of Germany. So the majority of the people live in poverty and food insecurity, and it is a threat to their lives. Climate change is also a threat in a country like Niger Republic, where 75% of the land is covered by the Sahara Desert, and the majority of the people depend on subsistence agriculture to secure their livelihood. It doesn't matter if we come from Mongolia, Niger, Iceland, or Uganda. We all depend on the services that the ecosystems provide us with, and we are all affected by climate change. People living in developing countries are more likely to be hit harder by the effects of climate change and land degradation. But that does not mean that we are free of all responsibilities. We are all responsible to treat our Mother Earth the way she deserves to be treated, with respect. Our actions here in Europe, where we are now, do not only affect us, they also affect the beautiful two women in Mongolia there and the kids in Uganda. But what is the state of the global environment? We humans have been impacting the planet. The world population is now grown from 1.6 billion people to around 7.3 billion in the year 2016. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased, like you can see, and you know very well the freshwater use. We have been losing our tropical forests, etc. Over the last 20 years, land area that has been harvested has increased by 16%. Area under irrigation has doubled, agricultural production has grown nearly threefold, and worldwide, estimated annual soil loss due to erosion is 24 billion tons. And between the year 2000 and 2012, it has been observed from satellite pictures that 2.3 million square kilometers of forest have been lost, while 0.8 million square kilometers were reforested. So we have lost much more than we have reforested. At the same time, 1 billion remains undernourished, and enormous pressure on land resources due to rising food demands, global shift in dietary habits, biofuel production, and urbanization. Landfills, mining, and other extraction activities contribute to pressures on land resources. Land degradation and desertification is a global challenge, and it is of major importance. It's affecting both the environment, the climate, and human societies. Here you can see pictures from 4 different countries: Mongolia, Lesotho, Niger, and Iceland. So you can see that this is not only in some specific parts of the world, you can see it in many parts of the world. So it is a global problem. But what are the drivers of land degradation? The direct drivers include, for example, agriculture and forestry, urbanization, infrastructure development, energy production, and mining and quarrying. So these are the major drivers. To give you some key facts and figures of land degradation, it is estimated that a degraded land worldwide is 126 billion hectares. It's also estimated that 52% of agricultural land worldwide is moderately or severely affected by soil degradation. Deforestation is the major cause of carbon loss from soils. But second comes land management practices, including tillage, which is the second major driver of soil organic carbon losses. But what do we stand to lose with this land degradation? What I want to put emphasis on is our soil. We are losing our soils. Our soils are second largest carbon storage next to the oceans. Soil carbon accounts for 1/3 of global carbon stock. And healthy soils and soil fertility is very important. Soils are fundamental to life on Earth. Soil resources are reaching critical limits, and 1/5 of world population lives and works on degraded agricultural lands. So healthy soils and soil fertility is crucial both for climate regulation, for water and air quality, also to prevent erosion, desertification, and landslides, and to contribute to food security. And land use change is the primary driver of loss of soil organic carbon. And if we look at land use change in the last century, so you can see here, 1900, the year 1900, about 71% of land was natural or secondary forest, mountain, deserts, tundra, sloping lands, and area unsuitable for agriculture. This 70.1% went down to 46.5% 100 years later. So you can see that in 100 years we have changed our lands or our earth quite a lot. So there's a lot of land use change, and that is one of the biggest drivers of that we're losing our soils. But let's look closer at the interaction between land degradation and climate change. The carbon cycle is at the core of the land use effects on the greenhouse gases emissions. This is one of many graphs of the carbon cycle that you can find. But where is the carbon in the system? The Climate Convention defines three main stocks or carbon pools in terrestrial systems, both. It's firstly living biomass, above and below ground, it's dead organic matter, and it's soil organic matter. And if we look at this interaction, we can see that a land use sector represents almost 25% of total global emissions. And by halting land degradation and restoring degraded ecosystems, that is very important in the climate change mitigation. So the land is both a sink and source of carbon. So land can also, if you can think about it, it's both the solution, if we are restoring degraded ecosystem and sequestering carbon, and also the problem if we are losing carbon because of degraded lands. But what can we do? Well, we can sequester carbon in soil and vegetation by restoring degraded ecosystems. We can, of course, use the land in a more sustainable way, minimizing land degradation. And we can also minimize emission from drained wetlands. And I'm going to give you one example from Iceland. But peatlands or wetlands are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions from the land in Iceland. It's from drained wetlands. We have drained most of our wetlands, especially in the southern part of the country. But worldwide, 250,000 square kilometers of drained peatlands or wetlands are under cropland and grasslands, and 500,000 square kilometers are under forests. But when we drain wetlands and we make these ditches, like you can see here from Iceland, oxygen reaches the soil and the ecosystem starts emitting greenhouse gases. So we have now started restoring those wetlands by filling the ditches. But research on wetlands in the Arctic region, and the numbers for Iceland are the same as for the whole Arctic region, is that emission can be reduced by 20 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. So it's quite a lot. What we also need to do is that we need more research, we need more studies, and especially for grasslands. We know that grasslands are heavily influenced and destroyed by us, the humans. We have soy and palm oil, cotton, biofuel, but we still know relatively little about the ecological status of grasslands if we compare it with forests and other ecosystems. So it is important to study. So it is also important to remember that we are now here at the Climate Convention, the COP meeting, but we have three main conventions on environment at the UN: the Climate Convention, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Climate to Combat Desertification. And this is all linked. We should all work together, because soil erosion and land degradation is connected to both the climate change and biodiversity. Thus, the condition of the land provides this link between the main UN conventions. So it is important to prevent loss of biodiversity by sustainable land use practices and other measures to halt and prevent degradation. So this, you can see that this is more like the synergies paradigm. the kind of the negative side of it, but here you can see more the restoration side of it, the positive side of it. This synergy, you can say the restoration synergy, also applies when we are kind of turning the things around. Restoration adventure improve many aspects of biodiversity and can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, in addition to restoring a number of ecosystem services. So you can see here reduced greenhouse effects, restoration intervention in the middle, increased carbon stocks and reduced CO2 emissions, and restoration intervention also increases retention of nutrients in water and soils, restoring biodiversity, and also increased productivity and nutrient cycling. So it's all linked together. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, we are all responsible when it comes to keeping our Earth healthy. So we need to work together in solving the complex challenges we are now faced with. Climate change, land degradation, unsustainable land use, to mention a few. So we at UNU-LRT in Iceland, have been focusing on capacity building and training. So we are training people mostly from Africa and Central Asia, and we have our annual 6-month training in Iceland on land restoration and sustainable land management. But we also have now started training in our partner countries, and these pictures here are from Uganda, where we held a course specifically on climate change, land restoration and sustainable land management. And that was held in September this year, September-October, and that was held together with our local partners in Uganda. And we can really see that we have so much in common, and so that is also a lesson that we have learned throughout the years. And this is my last slide, just that remember that we have now, the international community is working with us. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and so by restoring degraded lands, we are not only working on Goal 15, we are also working on the climate goal, the goal on number 1 and 2. You know, it's all linked together. So that is my final saying here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few moments for clarification questions. We will have more time to discuss the content more deeply, but if there are any clarification questions, please, this is the time to ask. Everything? Yes, please?
In fact, I didn't understand well how CO2 goes out of the ground when there is this big digs.
The ditches.
Yeah.
Because when we have the wetlands, it's like a anaerobic situation. So when we have the ditches, the oxygen can get into the ground, and then the plant starts to rot. The plant material starts to rot, and then we lose the CO2. There is also a bit of methane emission from wetlands, but it's much less than when we drain them. It's much so these 20 ton of greenhouse gases that we can stop from emitting to the atmosphere, the emission, that is then we have already calculated the methane that healthy wetlands emit. But so it's just because the oxygen gets into the system, which is kind of locked when it's wet, and then they start to rot. The plant material starts
Thank
to
you.
If no further questions, we can move on. Thank you very much for the presentation. We can move on to the next presentation on socio-economic aspects of interactions between climate change and land degradation. As we have seen from the previous presentation, land degradation is a major global problem. In fact, the estimates using remote sensing data show that about 1/3, 30% of global land area contains land degradation hotspots. Those areas where where there is substantial levels of land degradation. We can see this in this map, which is based on biomass productivity-based hotspots of land degradation. All of this map is in red, so these are land degradation hotspots all across the world, all the different agroecologies, not only drylands, but all across the different agroecologies. And if you look at the anthropogenic improvement areas, only about 3% of the global land area over the last 3 decades. So the ratio of degradation to improvement is 1 to 10. 10 times faster degradation than improvement we have witnessed over the last 3 decades. So this degradation has enormous economic costs. According to different estimates, which use different methodologies, different focuses, this cost ranges from $300 billion annually to almost $9 trillion annually at the global level. So this is a global picture. If we move to the regional level, what we can see that the biggest share of this cost is in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the first here. About $60 billion and about 23% of the total degradation cost. So, and then we have Latin America and Caribbean and other countries. So what we can see here, land degradation, of course, it's happening all across the world, but some countries, some regions are losing more to land degradation. And specifically, land degradation having a very big economic impact on sub-Saharan Africa. So this brings us to the next part of the issue, is that how this is happening. Land degradation is affecting agricultural incomes, it's affecting the provision of ecosystem services, both provisioning and non-provisioning ecosystem services, and as a result it's having this big economic cost, but also it's having very strong socio-economic impacts in terms of poverty, in terms of different aspects related to people's livelihoods. So, at the same time, if you look at this map of global climate change vulnerability, what we can see is that the concentration of the countries vulnerable to climate change is also very much in sub-Saharan Africa, in some parts, and some parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia. And then when we move to another map, which is Global Hunger Index map, done by World Hunger Hilfe and IFPRI and some other partners. So what we can see here, again, there is some kind of strong impacts, hunger impacts on many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, Southeast Asia. So what we are seeing here is that land degradation is already now having a very strong impact on developing countries. And those developing countries which are affected by land degradation the most are also expected to be more vulnerable to climate change. And in many of the countries, of those countries vulnerable to climate change, affected by land degradation, even now, hunger is a big problem, especially for children and women. So if you look at schematically at the interactions between land degradation and climate change. So Hafdís Hanna talked about this part, about the carbon sequestration role of land-based land, and then different relationship between land degradation and climate change, going through changes in surface albedo, temperature, droughts, dust storms, and others. But what I would like to concentrate now more on this part, on socio-economic impacts, which we discussed now, and also policy responses. So this is the area where we could have some synergies and potential trade-offs. So policy, technological, institutional, and policy responses that will help us to address land degradation, and hopefully also at the same time help us to adapt to climate change or to mitigate climate change. Among those such policy measures, we know there are numerous technological solutions, sustainable land and water management technologies. Just some of them are listed here, but this can go on and on. Water harvesting, rotational grazing, agroforestry practices, conservation tillage, But the problem with many of those technologies, their adoption rates remain relatively low. And then there are some policy solutions, socio-economic institutional solutions like decentralization and local management of natural resources, securing property rights, improving market access, removing market distortions. And here as well, we can see that not often policy uptake of these enabling policies for climate change adaptation, for land degradation, addressing land degradation are not always very high. One example from Kenya. This is based on household survey, nationally representative agricultural household survey. So what we can see here is that 60% of all households surveyed do not use any SLM technology. And only 40%, the remaining 40% have different levels of use of SLM technologies. And this figure, 60%, is in some manner it can be quite encouraging, because there are many other countries where we have worked at ZEF on economics of land degradation, and this doesn't reach 60%, doesn't reach 40%. Adoption rates are smaller than this. So what are the factors that may help to adopt this kind of sustainable land management technologies, and also adopt those technologies which are climate smart? So cross-country analysis shows that there are some factors, socio-economic factors, which were consistently found to lead to better adoptions of climate smart and SLM technologies. Access to extension, so access to knowledge, capacity building at different levels, but also access to markets, to sell products, to buy inputs, but also to have access to credit, to financial markets. And also different other factors related to secure land tenure, access to irrigation, different farm sizes depending on the context. So, in conclusion, if you look at the interactions between land degradation and climate change, especially in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, I think there are a lot of opportunities for synergies, like, for example, using climate smart agricultural practices, which can help to both adapt to climate change, mitigate to some extent climate change, and also improve the communities and households' resilience. And building resilience is possible, perhaps, by improving policy frameworks using all the factors that we saw in the table, market access, secure land tenure. But at the same time, we should not ignore, be naive and think that there are all these synergies, there are also a lot of potential trade-offs. For example, just to name a few, increasing food production for food security may in some areas mean extension of agriculture to marginal areas and more land degradation. Or what we have seen in, for example, in Kenya, allocating property rights. We saw in the table that securing land tenure security is something good for improving investment into land. But our research in Kenya also showed that, yes, it helped in many areas which are located in near rangelands to improve investment into agricultural production, so crop areas. But those crop producers also then, instead of they started putting out more and more of their livestock to common property rangeland. So improving land tenure security helped the situation in one place, but then led to more intensified degradation to some other place. So there are this kind of issues which I think also require more attention and more further research. Thank you very much. I will also take a few clarification questions, because then we can move on and discuss it in more detail, the content. Yes, please.
I was wondering about the maps that you showed, where
Yes.
you see like a high overlay between climate change vulnerability and hunger and land degradation. I'm wondering if there's studies done, or if you can say anything about the causality between especially land degradation and hunger. I mean, I assume there is some, but how strong is that maybe?
Yeah. This relationship between land degradation and poverty, and in general in hunger, has been one of the topics which has been studied for a very long period of time. And then the causality is usually thought to be two-way. So vicious cycle, land degradation leading to poverty, but then poverty also leading to land degradation because of the lack of households, poorer households, capacities to invest into land. So there is not much, I have not seen a lot of research tracing the effect of land degradation to the level of nutrition. So micronutrient contents or different aspects of food security, of hunger. But in terms of poverty, there is a lot of research, and there are some kind of early research coming in that there is some linkages between affecting going to nutrition, because tracing all the way from land degradation to hunger and nutrition, there are too many factors involved, and to be able to say this is only because of land degradation and not because of something else is a very, very challenging. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. I just have a question, and maybe you can elaborate more a bit on extension services and advisory services and the importance also for adoption. And then another point is also about risks, potential risks of credits provided to small-scale farmers, for example, them being adapted over time.
Yeah.
So if you could just elaborate a little bit more.
Thank you very much for this question. This is going very much to the content part.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are fine, allow me, I will invite the panel.
Okay.
And then you will be given the chance to pose this question to our panelists.
Okay.
Would it be?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great. Any clarification questions? Yes?
I just wanted to ask you what is SLM?
SLM is
I never heard it.
It's an abbreviation standing for Sustainable Land Management.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes?
I have a related question to the first one, and I don't see really the linkage between land degradation and urban food security issues.
Yeah, this is also we will discuss during the panel. So, any abbreviations, something not understood, we can. Yes.
Well, actually, could you go to your last table, please?
Yes.
Yeah, that one. Larger. You had larger plot size, and I think in a different table you also had the extension of the land that is cultivated as one positive. That's my clarification? Is it the positive content for SLM?
No, here what we are seeing is that here by larger plot size, what I mean is that you take a farm, it can be half acre, hectare, or it can be 2 hectares, or can be 5 hectares. What we saw in some context is that those farmers which have higher, bigger farms, so they can have higher working capital, so they can afford investing into sustainable land management practices more than those smallholders, very small farmers, which may not have access to credit and other things. Yes?
Sorry to follow up on this, but on Monday we have learned that actually the size of the land that is farmed actually also has an impact on the biodiversity loss. So the larger the farms, the higher the risk of biodiversity loss. So maybe that's what we can also discuss in the panel.
Yeah.
Is it really the size of the farm, or is it other factors that would be relevant here?
What I mean is the plot size, farm size, nothing else, just farm size. Okay, let us now move on to the panel, because the panel will be this is background part. Now we have the main part, panel. I would like to call our panelists to the front, and I would like to start with Professor Sokona. Professor Sokona is a vice chair of IPCC. He has more than 35 years of experience working on issues related to environment, climate change, energy. Before joining as vice chair, before becoming vice chair of IPCC in 2015, he was also the co-chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation, climate change mitigation, and before that he was involved in IPCC since 1990 as lead author in many different special reports. Professor Sokona also was the coordinator of Africa Climate Policy Center and also the executive director of Sahara and the Sahel Observatory. Welcome, Professor Sokona. And I would like to welcome Dr. Claudia Ringler. Dr. Ringler is a Deputy Division Director at the IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, Environmental Production and Technology Division. She's also the lead for the water research at IFPRI, and she's also leading the theme on water, land, ecosystems CGR program. Welcome, Dr. Ringler. We are very happy to have you here as well, because especially since you are a graduate from this center. I would like to welcome Mr. Jonas Muleso Kharika, head of the UNCCD Science, Technology and Implementation Unit. Mr. Kharika, he has been involved with UNCCD in this position for some time, but even before that, he was actively representing his country, South Africa, as UNCCD focal point. And also, he was being very active in these related areas, in his capacities, in his work, during when he was involved with Department of Environmental Affairs of South Africa. He has a long and very rich experience of working with international conventions, international and regional different initiatives. So we are very happy to have you here, Mr. Kharika. And our last panelist, Dr. Hafdís Hanna Aegisdóttir from UNU-LRT program, Land Restoration Training Program. I already introduced her earlier, so you're also welcome. Please, so before we go to the discussions, all these interesting questions that were posed by the audience, let me start with the first round of questions and ask you, Mr. Kharika. So I know that UNCCD during this COP has advocating, and before that for some time, advocating for land-based solutions for climate change. And from that perspective, what is the role of UNCCD in this climate change, land degradation discussions, and more specifically also, not only separately on this discussion, but also specifically on the nexus, on the linkages between climate change and land degradation?
Okay, so everyone here knows the history of the 3 Rio Conventions, I suppose, but we know that in this family of conventions, there is us, the UNCCD, the climate change, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So our role as the UNCCD in terms of our mandate, firstly, I think from the presentation that have been made by the colleague from Iceland, and supplemented by yourself, it is very clear that land degradation is actually a deterioration of, I think, soil and land and everything, as vegetation and even the water resources. So it's very clear. So our mandate is basically the business that we do as UNCCD is to combat desertification, land degradation, and the effects of drought. So with that, we find ourselves in the middle of the puzzle, because if we don't do our business right, then there's no adaptation discussions in climate change. And then if you don't adapt, if you don't get your adaptation agenda right, there is no mitigation. Then there is impact on food security and everything else that comes with it. There was a question here that was raised earlier on around someone wanted to know, one of the colleagues here wanted to know the linkage between, I think, land degradation and hunger. And I would invite that colleague, that colleague was, yes, come to Southern Africa, you come to where the region I come from, you'll see very clearly that some of the countries there, and I don't want to attribute, but we have land as people that we have taken or expropriated from somewhere, and then what has happened is that we are not able to really cultivate them properly, and they have degraded. And what have we done? We have migrated. So the business has been we degrade, we abandon, and we migrate. Why do we migrate? We migrate because there is no food to eat, and we're going to go somewhere to find source of livelihoods. So that's the linkage. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritties, but I'm just trying to give an overall. So in in the UNCCD, we are more involved with policy formulation, like all conventions, but policy formulation, enabling policies, helping parties to create enabling policies to deal with the scourge of land degradation, desertification, and the effects of drought. In that, then, most of the things that have been spoken here about sustainable land management comes in, and also helping countries to adapt. I would just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Sokona, so Mr. Kharika talked about enabling policies, but we also saw in the presentations that there are a lot of technological practices, a lot of policy frameworks which can help create the synergies between climate change and perhaps addressing land degradation. From your experience at different levels, at global level, but also on the ground level, what are your impressions? Why many of these technologies or many of these policies are not often taken up to that extent that we would like to see, or what are the barriers and challenges for that?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this conversation. And I've tried, it's a complex issue, the most complicated issue we have ever seen. And then it's, to do justice to the issue, it's need more than one day to discuss the issues, as it's complex. And I think that one of the critical aspects is working in silos. Working in silos, looking at the agricultural aspect, looking at water aspect, looking at the problem is much more complicated and complex. As it has been shown that land degradation issues, it is not only related to one place or one continent. It's broad, but the magnitude and the problems are completely different from one region to the other. And if you take the African case, the Sub-Saharan Africa or Circum-Sahara Africa, and I spent some years, 7 years, I lead one organization dealing with that issue, the Saharan Observatory. And it's too complex and complicated. And then when you think that the problem is here, and then 2 or 3 other problems pop up. And one have to look at one element is agricultural practice. If we take this Sub-Saharan African aspect region, it's only 3% of the agricultural land is irrigated in Africa. People need to, because of the growth of the population, and then people has to clear more land to have more production, because there is no improvement of productivity of the system. You clear more land, you degrade more land. This one element one have to, and then to change the system you need irrigation. And then that brings the energy aspect on it. And in the energy aspect, this is also one of the critical problems. Because in Africa, the energy consumption is from 60 to more than 90% of the energy consumption coming from the wood, firewood. And it was in the 70s, people were collecting dead wood, and then for cooking. And then from the dead wood, they moved to cutting trees. And then they still try to sustain unsustainable practices in the region. And then that is one of the fundamental also problems. If you add to agricultural practices, you need to clear more land, you add the energy component on it. This is only for cooking. And then add on that, because of the inability of the population to live on the agricultural practices, the small-scale holder, they migrate in urban area. In the urban area, they change the energy practice. From using the firewood, they move to the charcoal, and then you need 7 kilo minimum of firewood to have 1 kilo of charcoal. And then you see after the combination, the escalation of the problems. And it's so complex and too complicated. And in that region also, unfortunately, we have a limited scientific knowledge and evidence on the link between climate change and land degradation in that region. And then we have some information on climate variability related to that, but on climate change, we have a limited evidence. In order to have some evidence, you need to bring together 3 critical components that is completely separated. One is related to the biophysical aspect. And then that has been also presented by the first presenter from the United Nations University. Second, related to socio-economic aspect, and then you already mentioned that. And then the third component related to climatic variables. And then you have three different indicators and you need to bring together. One of my role when I was leading the CERESA Observatory was to create the observational system that will help you to better understand the complexity and then the implication on those different factors. But unfortunately, we do have limited element on those, limited fact on those, and then we are trying to look at an horizontal problem. We've tried to find solution in a unique aspect, to say that agroforestry is a solution. We were looking at those different aspects. Or improved stove is a solution. We were looking at the other aspect. But currently, we have a unique position and situation, and then to deal adequately with the problem, because we have two aspects. This is the SDGs. It's broader enough. It covers all the different aspects, and then that gives to you a new perspective how to approach the problem. In terms of the development, how you make it much more sustainable, you look at the land. This is one element. Second is related to the Paris Agreement. And then the Paris Agreement brings you also some element to start at the bottom-up perspective, provided that the national determined contribution is based on development agenda rather than something completely isolated. And then those are some of the perspectives I just wanted to bring to the discussion, and sorry to be too long, because this is an area I'm passionate, and then sorry to bring me back also to that aspect where I'm concentrating actually on energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Ringler, we saw in these two presentations, and in the presentations which I made, there are some global maps of vulnerability to climate change, of land degradation, but they remain global at relatively coarse resolution. They lack this granularity, and it is perhaps not always correct to assume that everybody in that hotspot is affected by land degradation. Some groups are more vulnerable, some are less vulnerable. Some socio-economic categories, some people may have higher resilience, some may have less resilience. And based on your research on these topics at IFPRI, who are, in your opinion, are the most vulnerable groups to land degradation and climate change? Why they are vulnerable, and what can be done about this?
Thanks. I'll move this question one step further, and I'd like to actually focus on women and men, so on gender and land degradation. Obviously, women, we know, are often more vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change, but not necessarily in all aspects. But what I'm relatively new to land degradation. What I was surprised about is that I haven't seen much on gender and land degradation. And we are currently implementing two studies on gender and land degradation, one in Uganda and one in Ethiopia. And the study on Uganda, I just got some data back, and it's basically reviewing old data sets for which we had also collected soil health parameters. And so what the basic findings are that soils were severely degraded in 2003 on both women's and men's plots. Soil health has actually slightly improved by 2013, so over a 10-year period. But the gender gap in soil health has remained. So, and some of the reasons for this gender gap in soil health, so women's plots are much more severely degraded, are because men's plots had more soil and water conservation techniques applied, more organic matter, and more fertilizer. And so basically all these important land management practices were much more concentrated on men's plots. And so what I believe is, everything that we've said so far is important, but I think we need to much more focus on women as an agent for change in land degradation, because currently we see that women managing, when they do have access to their plots or take some decisions on plots, they have much worse outcomes for land degradation. And in terms of what can we do about it, I think, again, that slide, not that slide, but that's not, I'll leave it on. But your earlier slide where you said extension matters, markets matter, tenure matters, and credit matters. And I think those are all entry points where we can strengthen women's women's roles as an agent to address land degradation. So my colleague Ruth Meinzendick just recently published a systematic review of the impact of women's land rights on poverty. And first, there's almost no evidence on that linkage, because we haven't done enough studies, and it's similar to land degradation and nutrition. There are so many factors affecting poverty. But there are a lot of interesting insights on pieces contributing to poverty. For example, women's land rights have been shown to directly support climate resilience, because once women actually own a piece of land, if there's a climatic shock, long-term drought, they can actually sell the land. It's better than if they couldn't even do that. There's also substantial evidence that once women have land rights, they're more likely to invest in appropriate management practices and technologies, especially those that have longer-term benefits. So not those, like a fertilizer that you need for one season, but we have more fallow in plots where women actually have rights over the land. We see more tree planting, and just more longer-term technology purchases. There's an assumption that stronger women's land rights are associated with better credit, which is one of those pathways, and actually that evidence does not exist. And again, the reasons are that there are all these other factors that prevent women from accessing credit. So the land rights alone are not going to do the trick, it seems, or at least there's no evidence. And finally, women's land rights can also directly support women's empowerment. Once they actually have right over a piece of land, they have a much stronger bargaining position in the household that has a whole bunch of other important nutrition and health outcomes. They also are suddenly talked to by extension agents. They're invited to participate in water use associations, farmer groups, etc. So a whole bunch of things you can only get if you actually have a title to a piece of land. But the other area that you have mentioned is access to information and extension. And this is now from another study in, sorry, I'll just turn around, or maybe I'll go there. So because I didn't want to mention all of this, I just put up the slides here. And so again, this is not a direct study on land degradation, but I think it's very important and related to land degradation. This was a study on climate change and gender, so why are women less likely to adopt agricultural practices that are good for climate resilience? And so the first point is, the message is always on the right, because there's too much data in the middle. So the first one is women have less access to information. So less access to information on these sustainable land management practices and others. And what you can see here for Kenya, Uganda, and Senegal, so in blue, it comes out blue. So those areas underlined in blue means that men have significantly more access to this type of information. For example, television. I guess women don't have time to watch. Information through schooling. Agriculture shows, so men tend to go, women will go. Even cell phones. You actually, we now have all these ICT interventions where we think this will do the trick, but you can see it might do the trick in the future, but not yet for women in those settings, because women don't have access. They don't receive information on these practices through those tools or through those channels. Women are more likely to obtain their information through some, it's called farm organizations, but that would be women's farmers groups, religious groups, and in Kenya also agri-service providers. Again, Kenya is more advanced. And family members, so they rely on more informal networks for information. So if we don't channel information on those practices and technologies through channels that reach women, we will not reach women. Okay, and then, so we know that women have different accesses or use different channels for information on agricultural practices, climate relevant practices. And then which practices do women know as a result of having less information? Unsurprisingly, less practices. So this is a question about awareness of various sustainable land management practices. I'm not sure if all of those count, are generally used as practices to address land degradation, because we use it more as climate resilient practices. And again, women were only more likely to be aware here of cover cropping, rangeland management, so that's from Kenya. Improved cook stoves, so we have heard that. So they were more likely to be aware of that in Senegal. But in Kenya it was the men, which is a little bit interesting because I don't think they do all the cooking there. Manure management, women were more likely to be aware of that in Kenya. Anyway, overall, men more likely of these practices. And sorry, I still don't know what you did. Okay, good. Okay, now, but the big message here is if women have equal awareness over those practices as men do, then they are, as likely, or in some places, or in some cases, more likely than men to actually adopt those practices. So if you get to that stage, if you use the right information tools, then we actually might reduce land degradation through women's empowerment. And so again, here, those are the practices where we see a lot more red here or orange. So there are many, many practices. If women are as aware as men, they are more likely to adopt them. And so here we have improved grain storage, which is has an indirect impact on land degradation. Mulching, composting, manure management, water harvesting, even irrigation and bonsai in Kenya, improved feed management because they have many roles over livestock, rangeland management, cover cropping. Anyway, so I just wanted to make the point. This is an important entry point. It was a very long, very long comment, but it's more or less the only one I'll make. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So before we go to our last panelist, I would like to give an early signal to the audience. Think about the questions you would like to pose, and then we can move, because the next section would be the discussion with the audience. Dr. Aegisdóttir, so we saw that it's very important to inform about these practices, capacity building, extension, but based on your experience, what kind of capacity building? Capacity building for whom? At what level? So what are these? What are the major issues related to capacity building which needs to be improved to achieve better sustainable land management and climate change adaptation and mitigation?
Thank you. Well, so we at UNU-LRT in Iceland, we are, like I said in my presentation, we are focusing on capacity building and training. We have, every year we have, since 2008, we have been running a 6 months training program, which is from March to September every year in Iceland. And that training program is, we are focusing on working professionals coming from countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. And what we think that works very well, at least in our case, is that we are working with specific local institutions in our partner countries. So we are mixing the groups. These are people from ministries, local communities like in Uganda, ministries in Lesotho and Niger, for example, universities, quite many universities, research institutions, even NGOs, for example in Kyrgyzstan and Mongolia. So we are working with different institutions, all local institutions, and these are, like I said, working professionals. So they are working on these issues. They all have a university degree, and then they get a leave from work to come to Iceland for 6 months and to study about land restoration, sustainable land management, etc. And I will tell you a bit more about that in a minute. Then they go back. They have to go back to their home countries and share the knowledge and experiences. And we think this is a crucial point, that they have to go back and they have to share their experiences, because we cannot train a lot of people. So it's a very personal kind of training. We are training, like this year we had 14 people from different countries, but we are maximizing the impact of the training by that we are like building up a critical mass of specialists who have been on our training within those partner institutions, so they can then make a difference. So this is our the core activity of our program, the 6 months training. So it is about, we give them a lot of the biophysical training. They're learning about soil science, land restoration, hydrology, all of that, because we think it is important that they understand that. But we are also adding, on top of that, we are, telling a lot about sustainable land management, and we have like conflict, how to deal with conflict, how to put all this, get all the stakeholders to the table, because many of our fellows, as we call them, they are dealing with so complex situations in their countries. You know, there may be environmental officers out in the, for example, in the districts in Uganda or in the ministries, that they are dealing with so many, you know, so difficult situations that they have to be able to like talk to everybody and know how to solve conflicts and so on. So we think so with this about land restoration, land degradation, sustainable management, but this kind of teaching them, you know, come to be like these agents of change. So it is also, we consider this a leadership program as well. So we are taking our fellows out of their comfort zones, taking them to Iceland in the northern, you know, in the cold and windy place, and they stay and, you know, they live and work together 24/7 for 6 months, and it is a huge challenge. These are women and men. We put a lot of emphasis on gender equality, so we always invite as many women and men to the program, and we have land tenure and all these issues in our curriculum. So they are, you know, people of, they're maybe from 25 to 40 years old, so they are in a different position at home, but then they come to Iceland and everybody, you know, needs to be equal, and Iceland is a very, we don't have a lot of different classes, you know, we just have, you know, we're kind of, so they have to go into that culture, and it is a challenge, but they learn a lot because they are, they have to be responsible for their own project. They do like a small research project, and then they take a lot of courses. So we have seen that they really, they get coaching lessons, you know, what do they want to do with this training, how are they going to serve their workplace and themselves and their country when they come back home. So they are really building up a capacity in many aspects. So this is the 6-month training, and then we have now started this short course training as well, where we are training more people in a shorter time. So it's a different kinds of training. So because you asked for whom, so I think we need to train both the people who are working with the people who are working on the ground, but also, you know, people in the ministries, people in who can affect policy, who can inform policymakers. So we think in UNU-LRT that capacity building is a crucial, really, to be able to solve these global challenges. We need to really train people and get, you know, to let them work with those who are working on the ground, and let people also, like you were saying with the silos, to, you know, go out of the silo thinking and work together, you know, crossing these sectors. So that is, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, we are, I already see a hand. We are ready to take questions from the audience. Just perhaps just briefly introduce who are you, and then say to whom you are asking the question, or if to several people, then you can say to several people. Please, so we start with Joachim. Yes. And then I have several hands. So we can take one round, and then let our panelists answer. Please, John.
Thanks, Alisher. Yes, I'm Joaquin Torina. I'm here from the Argentine delegation, but I'm not from the climate change delegation here. This is a curious point, but from the focal point of the UNCCD. So this is interesting, and therefore I think I'm pleased to be here because it's the place to be for me. Yeah. Okay, it's just a short state. I have two of them. As a coordinator of an adaptation fund project in land degradation in Argentina, we have some experience made that is quite, I think, on the drivers you showed today, Alisher. If I ask myself, what's the situation we see, that's because I think it's interesting. We have property rights there established. The extensions are huge. There are no small plots. There's a decentralized system of governance on the resources. Yes, and we have some access to credit. Yes, and there is extension services too. So why do they not make something that seems to be rational? Yeah, and I think this is the key question we have to ask. I think we have a lot of information, and even when these drivers are somehow given, I'm not saying it's perfect, yeah, but it doesn't happen, or it doesn't come to happen. And my state is that we often forget from our work, yes, our constraints, that SLM is investment. And we're asking for change, forgetting that we're asking for change on capital, yeah? Even if it's small or natural capital. But so for me it's very difficult to change things in my life every day, and you ask something from people on their capital. So we should not forget that. And so if drivers are given, if SLM is rational, then the problem is cultural, yeah? And the problem is political.
Okay.
Much more than that. And that's the state I would say we have.
Okay, thank you.
But could you just add rangelands or wheat production? I mean, which
rangelands?
Rangelands.
We are talking
Okay,
about
good.
rangelands,
Just to understand.
and,
Okay.
I'm not going to detail. I can't go
No,
into
just
detail
rangelands.
about
No, that's okay.
it.
Just I wanted to know what it was.
Okay, let us take 2 more questions before we start. Please, ma'am. Yes?
Hi, my name is Moderator. I'm from the University in Bonn, and I have a question. I want to make use of Professor Sokona's expertise on West Africa. I have a couple of questions there. One is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but most IPCC scenarios, or West Africa is one of the least clear trends in the future climate and variability in the IPCC scenarios. And other, some of the scenarios indicate that there will be more rainfall, others with more certification, and in different areas there are different probabilities or conflicting probabilities of also extreme events happening. And other school of thoughts have identified West Africa, or the West African monsoon, to be one of these big planetary boundaries and possibly tipping points in the Earth system. So my question is, one, you mentioned all of this complexity, but why is West Africa particularly unclear from a scientific point of view, the trends there? And 2, what to do in the middle of this uncertainty if we want to do something that is comprehensive and tries to, for instance, tackle food security, which is a cross-cutting issue in all of these problems.
Okay, let's take one more question. You wanted to ask a question? Yes, please.
Ursula Schäfer-Preuß, former Director General in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. I wonder how, Hanna, you could really scale up what you are doing in the 6 to 8 months program to reach more people, and would it not also be possible, you said well, you have now shorter training programs, to do it on the ground? So these are, I think, basic issues one has to look into when you really want to be more sustainable and have a broader effect with these, I think, very important initiatives and exercises, but for me they look a little too limited.
Okay. Let us now answer these questions, and then we can have the second round. Who would like to start? Yeah.
I can start, and I think that the question on Argentina ultimately is a policy issue related to, and then as far as I know, also the situation in Argentina, you are moving from livestock to agricultural, and then particularly the soy, and then those are policy aspects. Due to what I said, that is a much more complex and complicated. And then one cannot limit it that those are the solution, those are the perspective. And then to come to the issue of the IPCC scenario, this is a fact. Because this is what I indicated. I said that there is a limited scientific evidence. When we approved the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report on Working Group 2 in Yokohama, and that was on vulnerability, adaptation, and risks. When somebody said environmental issue in Africa, what will come to mind? If they say environmental, what's the main environmental issue in Africa?
Droughts.
Exactly, that was drought and then land degradation. In the IPCC report, there were no drought and then there were a map there giving some of the factors related to the climate factor, the climate related to that aspect. Africa, there were nothing, and then the African delegate get furious, and then they even block the approval of the SPM. And then we have to explain to them, it is not because you see something, you believe in it, that is scientific evidence. Because there were no scientific work on it to link that scientifically. Because IPCC is based on assessing literature. There were no literature. They do not understand it. And that was one of the, and then all the scenarios are global scenarios. You have limited information on a regional basis. And particularly in the African region, there is very limited information. One of the work I was trying to do when I was heading the Sarasaba Observatory is to increase the observational systems in the ground. Because you see that in many of the countries, even the meteorological information system is completely weak. And then you have climatic indicators that based on some of the indicators you have is the precipitation. The other are completely lacking. And then one of the most critical information for land degradation is the biophysical. And then you need to have observation system on the biophysical understanding, and then how the land is, and then we have limited. The only we have is socio-economic. And all those three components completely fragmented, not all bring together. And then the model they're using at the global level is not functioning at local level, at regional level, and then just forget about it at local level. Those are some of the issues. But we think that with the IPCC special report, we'll have a special report on land degradation, desertification, thermal land management, food security, and greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems that will bring the knowledge gap, and then as the focus of some of the critical element in the AR6, this assessment report, to give a prominence, a regional aspect. And then that will bring together some of the element of that.
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, so can't say too much about, IPCC scenarios, but yes, there's huge uncertainty, and what we usually suggest is to look for so-called no regrets options. So there are a lot of adaptation, mitigation, and development options that actually work under both a wet and a drier climate future. And yeah, there's always, and that's also kind of an interesting thing. So we have this big uncertainty, and the last thing you want to do is to not act. And surprisingly, when you actually, analyze a lot of the climate resilient measures and interventions, they work under both scenarios. There's some big ones, like build another big dam, like famous Fomi Dam. If there's no water that's going to fill that dam in the future, that might not be the best intervention. But there's a lot of smaller scale interventions that are supportive of both a wetter and a drier climate future. So that's it's a very general assessment, but I think you can actually move almost 80% along the way without knowing. It'll get hotter either way, so you can for sure do something on temperature, temperature stress tolerant varieties, etc. So there's a whole bunch of things you can actually do, even if you're not 100% sure is it going to rain a lot more, or is it going to rain a lot less. In terms of the rangeland, I'm definitely not an expert, but the 2-3 questions I would ask is, so you said they have very strong property rights, they have access to markets, they have extension services. So I would ask, what are those extension services currently training on? And are they actually still public or private? In a lot of these kind of systems, we move over into a private extension, and again, private extension services have very different agenda and different interests in terms of what they try to sell you. So I would look a little bit more into that. And then obviously also we know, price developments for some of those products that they're producing have not been very positive over time. But they will become more positive because we are, I think, slowly but surely moving into a much tighter food security situation again. And yeah, so those would be a few points I would look into. I mean, especially the extension service, because a lot of the things we're talking about here are not what extension services were trained on 15, 20 years ago. We are moving away from the tillage to no-till, et cetera, et cetera. But how often are they recertified, retrained? What are the modules that they're looking into? Yeah, thanks.
So I'll just start building on what my colleague has said here, and then I'll move on to the professor's contribution, because I think the Argentinian colleague is correct. Being an African myself, I know how much politics and culture actually play into this the game. I have been in places, including my own birth country, where you see politicians, for political expediency, they allow the wetland to go, or some forest reserve to go because of their own gains and corruption and all that. But down the road, you don't have now water in those wetland lakes and all that. It's there. So, I mean, and in those countries, the extension services are very strong. I know it. People go out there, and then the agricultural extension officers go out there and do the best they can. And just one statement from a political heavyweight changes the whole game. And also this cultural dimension is a very serious problem. So, yeah, like she's suggesting, maybe we can do better in the other elements of this puzzle. So Professor has also spoken about the work that the IPCC is going to be doing and the new chapters that are going to come, and that's like basically the work I've been hired to be coordinating from the UNCCD side. So working in silos, we are trying in the 3 conventions to break them. And I would like to draw you to the fact that I did say at the beginning that the UNCCD is very pivotal in promoting land-based adaptation. And then we because we are at the center of the 3 conventions somehow, because you should understand that everything else that has been said here, and even from the presentations, and even if you look at the 17 goals of the SDGs, you will find that the common denominator there somehow, whether like it or not, is land and the issue of soil. If we can't get that right, we don't get everything else to happen, I promise you. It's almost like the sine qua non of what we need to be doing moving forward. As a result, what has happened is that in those bunch of goals, I think goal number 15 is basically where our business at the UNCCD is located, specifically 15.3 target 1, 15.3.1. And it's 2-pronged there, and it talks about avoiding and halting, right? What we've been doing wrong, but at the same time, and that's avoiding and halting land degradation, but also reversing what we've been doing to avoid what I said earlier on, that we degrade, we abandon, and we migrate. Then that leads to social conflict and all sorts of things that you just have to look the other side of the Mediterranean, and you will know what I'm talking about. The southern side of the Mediterranean, you will know. So with that, the indicators that we are focusing on right now is the land cover, land productivity, and carbon stocks. So already you can begin to see the linkages with the climate change work and what we're doing. And then I know that as the UNCCD itself, as a secretariat, we are also helping countries. We have got about 113 countries now that have signed up to the land degradation neutrality target setting, because that's what 15.3 is about. And we help them in monitoring and all that. So slowly, and then we are also going to help them by transformative projects. And the Great Green Wall, if you have heard about it, is a good example within the Sahel, which Professor I'm sure knows. If you wake him up at night, he will be able to tell you what this thing is all about. So you mentioned somehow the issue of the missing link between gender and land degradation. But I'm pleased to tell you that also, and the audience, that at the last COP now, COP 13, which was held in September in Mongolia, I think we adopted the COP adopted amongst many decisions, but there were 3 policy frameworks that were adopted. It's the one on gender. I can make that information available to yourself, and also the one on sand and dust storms, but more importantly, the one on drought and the drought initiative that follows that, to assist countries to develop frameworks around that. So I think, in short, that's just to bring in some element of highlighting what we are doing to promote synergies and break the cycles that Professor has been concerned about, because they're real. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes. So about the capacity building, thank you for the question. We have now started to scale up. This year we started this course focusing on land degradation, sustainable land management, land restoration and climate change in relation to climate change. That was on the ground in Uganda, in western Uganda. So we did that together with the National Environment Management Authority in Uganda and Makerere University. So it was a collaboration with our Ugandan partners. And then we were trained 25 environmental officers, specifically from Western Uganda. Next year this course will be held a bit northwest. So we will then be training another 25. We decided to stick to 25. We could have invited 30, but we have 4 training programs in Iceland, similar to ours, but are focusing on other things. One is on fisheries, one is on geothermal, and one on gender equality. And by discussing with the other training programs who have been having such courses, they do not necessarily recommend to have too many participants, because it's also about the quality of the training. So we have 25. So that is what we're doing on the ground. Next year we also have a different kind of course in Mongolia, on the ground in Mongolia. So we have started to focus also on short courses in our partner countries. However, we think that the 6-month training program in Iceland is kind of the crown jewelry in our work, and that was because we are very carefully selecting our participants. We do that together with our partner institutions. We go and visit those countries regularly. We take personal interviews with the candidates, so we get very good people, and they get a leave from work, so they have to go back, like I mentioned earlier, and they have to share the knowledge. And this view of ours, that this was really a good way to do things, was also, so we went through an extensive external evaluation now this year, where there was a Swedish evaluation team that was evaluating the programs in Iceland, and so they also said that this was a very good. So they went to the partner countries, they talked to the head of the institutions, to the former fellows and so on. And I think the reason why that works well is because they are taking out of the comfort zone. They are really learning a lot because they are sharing so many. It's not only that we are teaching them, they are teaching us a lot. These are all specialists. They are learning from each other. So they're really building up their networks. They are seeing things with a different eye. But that then together with the short course training on the ground, I think is a good combination. But also in the 6-month training in Iceland, so the first 3 months are dedicated to coursework, to indoor and outdoor training, like field trips and so on. And we have been, over the years, increasing our practical training, because that has been both from our partner institutions, from our fellows, and from the head of the institutions in our partner countries. They have been always asking for more practical training. So we have been increasing that. But in the latter half of the training in Iceland, each participant, they focus on a small research project. Mm-hmm. And that project needs to be related to their home country and to their work at home. So many of them bring data from home, that they are then analyzed when they come back to Iceland, or they even send questionnaires or surveys, and some of their co-workers are gathering the data, and then they say we have to, if they do an Icelandic project, it has to be related, because we have a lot of land degradation in Iceland, so we can also it can be related. So that's why I think it can be sustainable. But thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have some limited time for another second round of questions. Because we have 5 to 10 times, I would like to suggest you formulate the question or comment very briefly. So we could start from you, and then yes.
Marcelo Cunha from UNCCD. Thank you very much for the input from the panel. And on the synergies, Mr. Kharika already mentioned among the different 3 Rio conventions, including CCD. What do you think could be or is already the role of UNU to promote that, right? Because UNU is also generating knowledge and doing this capacity building. I see from the format you're talking about, there's a lot of potential also to bringing together people with all these 3 backgrounds related also to the 3 conventions, to bring them together to exchange about biodiversity, climate change, and also land and land degradation, droughts, and desertification. How do you see, do you think this could be also a potential that could be further explored to promote these synergies, or is there already something being done by UNU?
Mario Letze from United Nations University here in Bonn. Since we're talking about land degradation and climate change, I was wondering, in terms of climate change, we see a lot of adaptation initiatives, for example, risk insurance, such as seed insurance, for example. How could seed insurance, to give one example, be a factor for possible maladaptation or possible incentive for agricultural practices which actually increase agricultural practices which pose a threat for land degradation, for example, as non-sustainable land uses. So how could there be a conflict between the adaptation to climate change, but actually a threat to land degradation?
Yeah, I don't exactly know what a seed insurance is, but
my name is Esther from UNU as well. The question goes to Ms. Claudia. You've already given us the statistics on gender and climate, but is your institution doing something more on this data to alleviate the problem and how far do you think we are in this journey to achieve such significant impacts on our?
Okay. Final question, comment? Yes?
Okay, my name is David. I'm doing a research again. My question goes to Dr. Sokona. You rightly mentioned that farmers in Africa resort to extensification, that's area expansion, to meet their household food needs. A recent work published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences did mention that most of these expansions are attributed to the centralized nature of irrigation schemes in the vulnerable regions. What role could distributed irrigation systems play to help minimize the current pace of area expansion? And what could be the role of policy and local and global policy formulation process?
Okay, I would like to suggest we just go make a round, and we would give each panelist 1 minute to answer the question. So, Mr. Kharika, you can start.
Well, there was nothing directed particularly at me, so
you give you a minute to answer. No, I'm joking.
Maybe I should give it to my colleague. Maybe I can say something at the end.
No, please. Okay, but you can go at the end. It's fine.
Yes, because I think the one I can comment on is the one of insurance. Yeah, because I think the issue there is to have the proper safeguards. I'm not from the climate change environment, but I know, being what I see from the African continent, because we're talking about mostly like peasant farmers, the subsistence farmers, and you can wipe out everything they're doing in one go by not trying to do the right thing. So if the safeguards are not right, then the insurance schemes have actually been a failure from day one, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe to follow on insurance, I would like to hear from our Argentinian colleague. But I have seen a study that was in progress that looked into the negative implications of livestock insurance. So basically, if you have insurance, if there's a drought, you lose your livestock. So then, so farmers are like, yeah, so I can have as many livestock as I want, because the next drought comes, I'll get compensated for all the livestock that die. And so basically, you could potentially get rangeland degradation through livestock insurance. So again, as you said, it depends on what safeguards you implement, how you implement the insurance. It's a little bit tricky because, of course, we do want to protect farmers from these adverse impacts of drought. Gender and insurance, that's something we have done some research on, and we found that in the example of Bangladesh, they have less literacy, less numeracy, are more likely to buy agriculture-related insurance products that are not adapted to their needs, because their overall understanding in agriculture is lower. At the same time, they have an interest in agriculture insurance because they know that's the mainstay of the household family income. So that's something also that's very important. There's a lot of companies, a lot of donors that push insurance out, whether index-based insurance, etc. But there's not much on, creating awareness of this potential risks. Selling at the end is going to be the private sector is going to sell those insurance products, and the impacts for actually women in the household might be quite substantial once we let the private sector go with it. Because again, they'll sell you whatever is in their best interest and not necessarily in the best interest of women farmers. There's also some work that has shown that women might be interested in other types of products, insurance products that go beyond just agriculture, and maybe a linkage of a saving product and an insurance product might be helpful. The other one, gender and climate change. I think a lot is being done, a lot more work than just 5 years ago. So it's still a relatively recent topic, but there are, I think, so there's a whole bunch of linkages between gender and climate change, and some of those linkages are increasingly well explored. The challenge is it's very context specific, so we might be able to say a lot about some regions, but not that much about others. In terms of has it reached the top of the agenda? No, of course not. I think a lot has to be done, but there are some very strong civil society organizations that are very good in advocacy, and so I think they're trying to push things ahead. One example is, for example, the Canadian government just released a feminist international assistance policy, where I think 83 to 95% of all funds have to be focused on gender issues. So that's a pretty bold step. I think we see a lot more. So we're moving in that direction. On the land degradation gender situation, I can't say that much, but it sounds like there's a framework. So it's very good to see, how that framework is being implemented, how funding is redirected or directed to those issues. So I think I'll be very interested to learn more about that. Yeah. That was a bit more than a minute.
I'll try to stick to a minute, but addressing the three questions. On the United Nations University, what they can do, I initiated a work with UNU on climate and migration, because people talk about it, but there is limited scientific evidence. When I was at Sahara Observatory, we initiated work on that, and then this is progressing knowledge that will feed the IPCC process, that will inform the policy. This is some of the things that can be done. And then we also did some kind of work with United Nations University when I was at the African Climate Policy Center, and then on the slow onset climate aspect, because there is also some limited evidence on that, and then we made some publication in peer-reviewed literature, and then that has been also incorporated in IPCC assessment. Those are some of the different aspects that can be done for a knowledge-based on institution. On the insurance, there is a limitation of the classical insurance in the context, at least in the African context, because of affordability of many people. That cannot be the only solution. And then one have to explore, and that's also related to the production of knowledge. There is different scheme of insurance related to the socio-cultural context. Because in many African countries, you are secure if you have more social relations. And then one have to explore those different things. You have to look at outside the boxes, because the classical insurance system will be limited, and for obvious reason. And then on the agricultural system, I'm not looking at the big agricultural system. I said that there's only 3% of the land irrigated, and then the large part of the agricultural system in Africa is less than 2 hectares. Actually, with the renewable energy technology, you have the possibility of irrigating less than 2 hectares. The technology is available, it's possible, and then to do it. And this is one of the critical components. One have also to look at beyond the irrigation. People do not have a clear idea in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. In the agricultural system, they are using less than 7 kilos of fertilizer per hectare in sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa and North Africa, they are using 60 kilos per hectare. In China, 250 kilos per hectare. And then if you have a fragile ecosystem where you use only 7 kilos, in some countries less than 1 kilo per hectare, and then you increase the degradation of the land. You know, all of those aspects are completely overlooked in the global figure, and then they just said that you need to go agroecological system, and then that's a completely degraded land, and then those are completely overlooked.
Yeah, I totally agree that the UNU has an important role to play in promoting the synergy among the conventions, and both, UNU is, focusing on research, on dissemination of knowledge and policy and so on. And we are absolutely doing that in our program in Iceland. Not only, training about plant restoration and sustainable management, but of course linking it to climate and to biodiversity and so on. And then, there are quite many institutes of the UNU around the world, and we have one very important here in Bonn, and we have here, I guess, some people here in the audience who come from the UNU-EHS. So there are different works being done around the world. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. With this, we would like to thank very much our panelists for their very informative discussion, and I also would like to thank you everybody for coming here to this side event, and would like to invite you to lunch, which will be served here in the lobby. Thank you very much.